Hello everyone and welcome back to the channel. First of all, thank you for your patience. I ended the last video with a request for opinions as to whether I should play Midway or Guadalcanal when I came back to the Avalon Hill and Smithsonian cooperative game series. Sorry, the game series they produced in cooperation. You guys know what I mean. It's Sunday afternoon. So apologies for taking a while to get cracking. I thought I'd leave it an extra day or two, and life got a bit busy, just to give everyone who wanted to cast their vote a chance to do it. And of course, these things being what they are, by my count, we had a perfect split down the middle between those for Midway and those for Guadalcanal. So what I did in the end was that I used the time-honored method of resolving these questions, and I rolled a dice. So Guadalcanal came up. So many apologies to those of you guys who wanted Midway, but I hope that Guadalcanal will be a useful demonstration all the same. So what I've done is I have set up the scenario for the Battle of the Eastern Solomons in late August 1942. Now, I chose this action for two reasons. The most important one being I'm an overambitious idiot who decided to bite off more than he can chew, because as you can see from the map, there are a vast number of task forces sort of wandering all over the place doing different things. This battle, almost more than any other bar Midway, shows the Japanese fondness for multiple forces doing multiple exciting things, some of them barely within mutually supporting range. I mean, it's magnificent as a plan, but it's a bit of a headache to try and keep track of. So anyway, I like this, though, because what it gives me a chance to do, I hope, is demonstrate all the various facets of this game. So, of course, you've got the potential for carrier-on-carrier actions. If the US Navy decides not to be too shy, there may even be some surface actions, but it wouldn't be a good idea for them to engage in those. And, of course, for the Japanese, there's going to be some amphibious landings. In fact, they've already had one try. If I just turn the camera down a little bit, I think you can already see it. Yeah. So I've actually started this recording on the afternoon of the 24th of August. And the reason I played a couple of turns just to get things started was partly to get my hand back in, because as ever with these things, and with my memory being what it is, there's rules I've forgotten, certain key things I needed to remind myself of. But the other thing was, while these games are wonderfully tense in their opening turns, you do get some turns where there's a lot of scout planes wandering around, doing their best to find the enemy. But aside from that, not a lot happens. So I thought I would just play up to a point where initial sightings were made, and not just sightings, but solid information. Woo, sorry, just hit my camera. Solid information as to where the enemy were. And then we could take it from there, because, having said all that, the scouting forces of both sides have done quite well in this scenario, and it looks like the 24th of August will be the day for some fairly big carrier exchanges. So I'm going to launch into those in a minute. Now, just a bit of housekeeping. Those of you who are familiar with this game will see that immediately that there's something slightly wrong here. Where is the other search board? And why is everybody on the same search board? So essentially, I set out considering doing a demo with two search boards, but two things militated against this. One, probably the more serious handicap, is that my brain is simply not that big, and trying to run two search boards would just lead to total confusion on my part, and probably total confusion on your part as well. I do tend to solitaire this game from time to time, and I find it's just so much more manageable keeping things on one search board and pretending that I can't see the other guy when it suits me. The other thing is my phone camera's breadth of vision and the limitations of my phone stand. It simply would not have been able to take in two search boards, and you wouldn't have been able to clearly see what was going on. So I beg your indulgence for that one, and I hope you guys will be okay with me just using the Japanese search board with everyone on it. I'll try to narrate both sides as even-handedly as I can, and of course, when I'm talking for one side or the other, we'll just do our best to pretend we can't see the other guy. I hope that will be okay, at any rate. So, just to give you a sense of what's been happening in terms of the strategic situation. So, the Japanese objective is to score a lot of points by landing troops on Guadalcanal. They want to kick the Americans out of their very recent lodgment in Henderson Field. At the same time, they want to maintain the pressure against Allied positions in southern New Guinea. So it's a bit of a tricky one for the Japanese because they've got a lot of forces on the map, but at the same time, they have very widely dispersed objectives. And just to make life really awkward for them, there's also US carrier forces in the area. The US objectives are much more simple. Protect Henderson Field, make sure those Japanese troops don't land, and also, if they can, severely damage the main Japanese carrier forces, because of course a major victory at this stage so soon after Midway would give the US Navy carte blanche to basically do what they like in terms of carrier warfare. So both sides have a big stake in gaining carrier superiority in theatre. Because of course, if the Japanese do it, then even if they can't take Guadalcanal with this offensive, the US garrison will probably have a very stark choice of either evacuating or doing their best to maintain this toehold in the face of Japanese air superiority, which is not a pleasant prospect. Certainly wasn't a pleasant prospect in the summer of 1942. So just to zoom in and give you a sense of what everybody is. Sorry, let's just get this thing, see if I can get it to behave. Okay. So the US Navy's dispositions, at the moment, they have 3 task forces in play. Task Force 11 is centered around USS Saratoga, Task Force 16 USS Enterprise, and down here Task Force 18, which is built around USS Wasp. The Japanese have, as you've seen, an immense number of task forces. So moving across this confusing swathe of things, the so-called attack force is the bait in the Japanese plan. This is the light carrier Ryujo with the escorting cruiser Tone and some destroyers. Her job is to distract the US by absorbing air attacks, after which the main force, the strike force built around Shokaku and Zuikaku, the 2 big carriers, will launch a counteroffensive and hopefully sink their American opposite numbers. The convoy force here is another critically important one because that is the force bringing the Imperial Japanese Army soldiers towards Guadalcanal. The cover force is a group of cruisers. The strike force, of course, Shokaku and Zuikaku, and the main body is the battleship Mutsu with some escort. So, a bit of a grandiose name, main body, for a single battleship, but there we go. And then lastly, up here, we have the invasion force, which is carrying yet more troops for Guadalcanal. So this is a bit of a two-parter, really. And the Japanese are going to gain victory points for unloading said transports here or here. Now, I did mention earlier that previously the scouting elements of both sides had done extremely well, and it is quite true. So, unsurprisingly for the Allies, the sea is absolutely swarming with Japanese task forces, so it's inevitable that some of them would have been sighted. US patrols were extremely busy, and they were able to get accurate information on Ryujo's carrier force. They know what Mutsu is, or at least they know she's a battleship. And they also have identified the cruisers, sort of, in the cover force. Most importantly, they have an accurate heading and composition of the convoy force, so that's provided very timely warning to Henderson Field. The Japanese have been somewhat less successful in their reconnaissance efforts. They managed to miss the two of the three US carrier task forces, but they did get a very accurate fix on the Enterprise's task force. Now, if you're wondering how I've been going about conducting the searches, I do have a dice-based system where I roll against a scout's capacity in terms of its range and how densely occupied the sea area it's searching is. So based on that, the US tended to do a bit better, but that was partly luck of the dice favoring them. Of course, when we get into the phase of the turn, I'll explain how scouting is supposed to work in this game. But I just wanted to set up a situation where some task forces would be found and others not. So the US has definitely won the reconnaissance side of the morning into the early afternoon, but they have made one critical error. Well, I won't call it an error, they've just been unlucky. They have not found Shokaku and Zuikaku. So although they've managed to find a load of Japanese forces around it, the main Japanese carrier force is still invisible to them, and that's a bit of a problem. There were also some exchanges of blows earlier in the game which will have an impact on what happens in this turn. So the Japanese have already suffered losses in the sense of, sorry, let me just straighten this out. Come on. So the Japanese have already suffered losses because their initial, stop shaking about. Sorry guys, talk among yourselves while I wrestle with this thing. The Japanese attempted to run some transports through to land troops at Gili Gili. Now this effort failed because the Allies were on the ball and spotted them almost immediately, and all of the transports were sunk as they made their approach. Now this did not go all the Allies' way though, because the other part of the Japanese offensive against the Allied positions here was that Gili Gili was extremely heavily bombed, and as you can see from the number of hit markers the base has got, it was given a pretty thorough working over. So what's likely to happen as the afternoon of this day wears on is that the air forces on both sides and the bases in these localities are going to continue what's effectively become their own private war. So they're not exactly out of the main battle, but they've got distractions there. Now the problem is, if one side or the other gains an ascendancy, then there's the possibility that they can redirect their aircraft to assist in the other theatre. Over here, there was a little bit of desultory air activity once the scouts found various targets, but the US side was being rather cautious. They didn't have a complete intelligence picture of what was going on, and so they very wisely decided to hang on to their strike aircraft until they knew a bit more. The Japanese performance was a little bit more mixed. So Shokaku and Zuikaku did the same thing. They had spotted one US task force, the Enterprise Group, but at the time their strike force was at the limit of its range, and they didn't like the idea of sending in penny packets of bombers that would arrive at the end of their fuel endurance. It would not be a good idea, so they've decided to hold the strike for now. What they did do was have the Ryujo throw an incredibly, if you pardon my language, ballsy attack on the Enterprise with her Kate torpedo bombers and a strong Zero escort. And although they were unsuccessful, all of the Kates were downed. But nonetheless, the Japanese escorts did rough up the US combat air patrol quite badly, and a couple of the Japanese bombers did get within torpedo dropping range of the Enterprise. So the Enterprise did beat off that attack, but it has probably left old Frank Fletcher feeling a tiny bit shaken and questioning the validity of at least one of his scouting reports. i.e., is that really a light carrier? And if so, why is she behaving so aggressively? You know, you'd expect a fleet carrier to act like that. Of course, the truth is Ryujo wants to be attacked. She's doing the naval equivalent of waving a big placard around going, me, pick me, pick me. Whether the US bites, of course, is another question. So I'm just going to head over in this direction so we can have a look at the Japanese organization chart. So up here we have the warships. So there's Shokaku and there's Zuikaku with their various air wings. You can see the cap from the previous turn, and the scouts have landed, so they're going to be spending this turn refueling. But the strike packages and their escorts are on the deck, they're spotted, they're ready to go. And over here we've got Chikuma, who is attached to the Shokaku and Zuikaku group. She has her recon birds ready to go. The seaplane carrier Chitose is the same. She's got her recon planes ready to go, and she is attached to the support force, which is lurking somewhere in the middle of the Japanese formations. The Ryujo, of course, after her sterling work the previous turn, has her entire air group down and is frantically refueling and rearming them. Down here, you can see the compositions of the various task forces. Or at least, I know you probably can't see them all that clearly on this, but I'll zoom in more closely to others as we get to them. The Japanese convoy force, as you can see, has already been attacked once by planes from Henderson Field. The escorting destroyers and the light cruiser Jintsu were able to beat the air attack off, but some of the destroyers have suffered damage in return. And here we have the Japanese land bases. Buka is not really open for business at the moment, although it does exist as a small emergency field. But the main heavy lifting is being done by Gasmata, Lae, and Rabaul. Shortland at the moment, at this stage in the campaign, is only hosting flying boats and seaplanes, so it's not really that useful. Coming over to the US side, you can see at the top here are the 3 US carriers. Now, Saratoga contributed some torpedo bombers to an attack on the Japanese convoy force, and oh no, she didn't. I lie. Sorry, they're in the ready box. What am I talking about? She is going to contribute her torpedo bombers this turn, unless a juicier target comes up. The same is true of Enterprise, who's got her strike package ready. However, her cap has had to land because, as I say, the combat air patrol got a bit roughed up the previous turn. You see there's one hit marker on one of the aircraft counters, but they did do a good job of keeping the Japanese away when the Ryujo launched her attack. Wasp, far to the south, was actually caught refueling when the Japanese operation was initiated. So this task force is slightly slower than the other two because they're still conducting fueling operations. So it's both a disadvantage and an opportunity because she's at the limit of Japanese recon range, which means that although they have a vague idea she might be out there somewhere, they really have no idea where, and this will give her the chance to pull off some shenanigans. Aside from that, none of the US task forces have been hurt in the slightest. I mean, only Enterprise's group has been attacked, and none of the Japanese ordnance directed at them did anything. The picture is somewhat different with the Allied bases. So although Gili Gili was defended very well and the Japanese landing force was seen off in very short order, they have paid quite heavily last turn with some rather heavy aircraft losses, both in terms of the defense and offensive bombing of Japanese bases. So we're going to have to see what happens with them at the start of this game. Just so that you know, as with all scenarios in this game, victory is determined by the number of points you get for either fulfilling mission conditions, looking at you, the Japanese, with your landing zones on the western coast of Guadalcanal, or if you manage to pull ahead in points, and points are awarded for destroying enemy units. So if it comes down to a victory on points, the Japanese win if they lead the Allies by 10 victory points. The Allies win if they lead the Japanese by 25 victory points. And I think what that reflects is the fact that the Japanese were trying to do too much against the considerable power the Allies have already been grouping into the theatre. I mean, primarily the US Navy with its 3 aircraft carriers. And the fighting in the morning of August 24th has actually borne this out. The US is presently leading by 10 points to 0. So they're off to a pretty good start. And a lot of those points came from the Japanese transports, which were sunk here. So it is the afternoon turn of the 24th of August. I'll wrap up the pre-game debrief because I think I've said enough. And let's get on with a complete turn of Guadalcanal. So the first part of any given turn is the action phase, and I'm just going to be referring throughout to the complete sequence of play here. I am using some of the optional rules, but I'm not using all of them. So the first thing you do at the head of each turn with the action phase is you determine who's going to be side A and who's going to be side B. Now this comes down to a straight roll-off between the two sides. So black dice US, red dice Japan. Okay, so Japan is side A this turn, which is interesting. They were side B last turn. Side A has a tremendous advantage because side B has to do everything first. And if you happen to know a lot about what side B is and where they are, this can be very useful indeed. So next we get the assembly step. And this is the point at which air units which are going to fly this turn have to take off in this phase. Now both players have a lot of decisions to make this turn because they have both the previous turn managed to find good information on the whereabouts of enemy task forces. And even though when the task forces move, those that aren't covered by patrol aircraft will suffer a loss of contact, the enemy still has a pretty good idea of where they are. Now, the reason you're faced with an important decision here is there's 2 ways you can play your strike aircraft. You can either keep them on the deck, pending a turn where you know you'll have definite information, i.e. if a long-range patrol aircraft is shadowing a sighted enemy force, or you can order them all up into the air, or a portion of them, in the expectation that your scouts will find something this turn, you hope, and you can then order a strike to go in. Now, of course, the downside to that second option is that if you order a strike package into the air and your scouts find nothing, or at least nothing within range of your aircraft, then they've effectively wasted their time and will have to spend a turn refueling. So because the United States are side B, let's go and have a look at them first. Now, just angling the camera back as a quick reminder, they have exact information about Ryujo's attack force, and they do have a patrol aircraft shadowing the force, so they know they're not going to lose contact. They also have precise information on the convoy force heading for Guadalcanal, and they again have a patrol aircraft shadowing it. They do have precise information on the battleship and cruiser forces, but strategically those are a bit less important than finding the carriers and the troop transport, so they're fairly happy with that. So with a shrewd idea that they're going to have targets no matter what, the US are going to order as many aircraft as they can up into the air. So let's start with Enterprise's group, because she's been sighted. Ready on her flight deck is Bombing 8, Scouting 8, and Torpedo 3. So 2 squadrons of dive bombers and a torpedo bomber. Now, Enterprise's launch capacity is 4 when she's undamaged. She can launch more than that, but if she does, she will have to make some awkward decisions about whether some go about where to place them, because if you launch aircraft within your launch capacity, they all go into the normal strike box and there's no penalty. If you exceed your launch capacity, it affects both your combat air patrol and your maximum strike. So those planes that end up in the maximum strike box, the excess aircraft, suffer a penalty to their range. What that represents is the fact that you have to loiter around waiting for the rest of the strike package to get into the air. The same applies to the combat air patrol. If you are launched in excess of your carrier's capacity, you end up having to be on low cap, so you can only intercept torpedo planes and low flying things like that, rather than going into high cap. Now, Enterprise does have to take a bit of a risk because both of her fighters, I'll just angle up again, both of her fighters are still in the arming box. So regardless of what else she does, there's not going to be any cap. There's also going to be no escort for her bomber packages. However, she does feel that the proximity of both Japanese carriers and the Japanese convoy force necessitates taking some risks. So she is going to launch all of her combat aircraft in a normal strike. That's 3. But she's also going to send up one of her 2... Oh, no, she won't, because they're refueling. No, sorry, ignore me. Yep, so the Enterprise is going to launch her strike package, and because it's only 3 of her 4 launch slots, they go into the normal strike box. Now, Saratoga, which is actually closer to the Japanese forces, is also going to put up her torpedo planes into a normal strike. So Saratoga will do that. And lastly, what is USS Wasp going to do? She has the most options, but she is also the furthest away. So the question is, does Wasp think that she is going to be within range? Or more pertinently, are the Japanese going to be within range? Assuming a worst case scenario where the Japanese continue closing, she might be just about at the limit of her strike range, depending on what's sighted, but it will still be a bit of a long haul for her planes. So it's a bit of a risk, but it's probably worth doing. So she has quite a few aircraft on her decks ready to go. She's got her full bomber package with some fighters available. So she is going, because she's fairly confident that she's immune from attack. None of the Japanese have sighted her yet, and she's the furthest away from the known Japanese contacts. She's going to include that fighter as part of the strike force and hope that it has the range to keep up with any Japanese movements. So all of those go into her normal strike box. She won't contribute any scout aircraft this turn because she needs that launch capacity for her strike package. So she's going to rely on the land-based reconnaissance to get some answers as to where everyone is. So going down to the air bases, after the grueling morning they've had, Gilly, Port Moresby and Henderson are basically all out of usable aircraft. They're going to have to do some refueling and rearming. But Espiritu Santo down here has not been really engaged yet, and they have a huge pile of aircraft that they could potentially commit. So what they want to do, because this is probably the most important contribution they can make, they're going to launch 2 of their scout aircraft. So these get placed directly on the search board. And they've got a launch capacity of 5, so they can do a pretty good what am I trying to say? They can put together a pretty big strike package. They're going to hedge their bets and they're going to send up their B-17s. So that brings their launch total up to 4. They're not going to bother with a combat air patrol because going by the sightings of Japanese forces so far, even if the Japanese go at full steam towards Espiritu Santo, they're not going to be bombing it anytime soon. So the next thing they're going to do is they're going to send along with the B-17s, their longest range bombers is Bomber Squadron 3. So that's going to join the strike package there. The others will remain on the ground in reserve. So that is the entirety of the US air commitment done. Let's go and have a look at the Japanese. Now, the Japanese are very conscious that they need to work a bit harder than their US opposite numbers to actually try and find someone, because they know where the Enterprise group is, but they don't have any aircraft shadowing it. So they really need to get someone out there. Of the main Japanese carrier strike force, Zuikaku and Shokaku used up their scout planes last turn without any result, and those are currently refueling and rearming, as you can see on their launch boxes. However, they still have the aircraft cruiser Chikuma, so she is going to send up her scout plane. And so because it's a reconnaissance bird, I'll just turn the camera back. Sorry about the angle, guys. So that bird is going to launch. And what about the Chitose? Because the Chitose has 2 more reconnaissance seaplanes. And Chitose is quite beautifully positioned because she is part of the support force. Sorry, let me do this properly so I don't give you guys headaches. She is part of the support force and she is right there. She is very well positioned to cover this area. So the Chitose, recognizing the importance of what she's got to do, is going to launch both of her seaplanes. And I'll put those on top of her counter. Oh, on top of the task force counter even. Now, the question is, do Shokaku and Zuikaku want to risk launching their aircraft? And I think the answer is going to be yes, because the US is obviously very close. They are conscious that, the US naval forces rather than the US per se. So they're very conscious that Ryujo threw a punch at USS Enterprise and that punch was deflected. So they're hoping to get a bigger kick in this turn. So they will speculatively launch their aircraft in the hope that contact can be made and held with the US ships. So they are going to do things a little bit differently because they're both part of the same task force, which gives them a bit of flexibility. And they both have a launch capacity of 3. So Shokaku is going to, first of all, contribute her fighters to the strike force's combat air patrol. You can't be too careful, guys. So those fighters go into the cap box. And then with her remaining 2, she's going to send up her dive bomber squadrons, but she's going to keep her torpedo planes in reserve. So Shokaku's dive bomber squadrons go into the normal strike box. Zuikaku, meanwhile, sorry for all this dancing around with the camera, guys. Zuikaku is satisfied that Shokaku, her zeros can look after the strike force. So for her first of 3 launch slots, she's going to send her fighters to escort the bombers. And for the remaining 2, just to give the Japanese the tactical mix they love so much, she's going to send both her torpedo bomber elements. So the Japanese carriers between them have put together a very nicely balanced strike force. And they both have an equivalent one in reserve. which they can use on a future turn if things don't go quite according to plan, or if they manage to cripple a US carrier and need to throw a follow-up punch at it. So that is the carriers done. Let's just have a quick look at the Japanese bases. So, like their Allied counterparts, in the wake of the previous turn, the Japanese land bases don't actually have that many options. A lot of their aircraft are down and refueling. However, they do have a lot of scout planes, and realizing they're a bit behind the Allies on this, they're going to send up every reconnaissance bird they have available. So the Bettys at Gasmata are going to launch. They don't have much hope of finding anything this turn, but if they start off on their journey, it's something. Rabaul is also going to send up some Bettys in the hope of locating something useful. And Lae, which is hosting a pair of, I think those are, it's an Emily and a Mavis. So, oh no, two Emilys. So they've got some quite capable flying boats there. They are going to launch both of them. Again, there's going to be a delay while they reach the primary zone of operations, but at least they're in the air. In terms of conventional attack aircraft, nobody has anything available. So the Japanese land bases are mainly going to be contributing to the reconnaissance effort this turn, to the exclusion of everything else. So that is that. All the aircraft that are going to fly are now in the air. So what happens next is called the ready step. And this is the point at which all aircraft which are waiting in the arming boxes can be fueled up and sent forward. So going back to the US. Now, you don't have to do this, and one good reason for not doing it is if your carrier is about to enter combat, having aircraft ready on your flight deck if you come under attack from dive bombers can have very, very negative consequences indeed. So they may decide they don't want to rearm their planes until they've had a chance to back off and put some distance between them and the enemy. But then equally, if you don't rearm your planes, then you basically take away your offensive options. So Enterprise is definitely going to rearm and refuel her fighters and also her reconnaissance birds. The Saratoga is going to do the same because she really wants to have fighters available sooner rather than later. And same with the USS Wasp. She's going to bring these guys forward. Now, with the land bases, it's a bit of an easier decision because you're not as vulnerable as an aircraft carrier, although there's still a bit of a penalty if you've got aircraft exposed on your runways. But you may as well get everything forward. So Henderson, Gilly, and Port Moresby will rearm and refuel all of the aircraft that are waiting. Moving over to the Japanese. It's going to be much the same. So Shokaku and Zuikaku, they already have aircraft armed on their decks, so they might as well add to the pile of ready aircraft, and it's really just getting their fighters from the previous turn's combat air patrol ready again, so they will arm and spot those. Now, Ryujo has an interesting choice to make because, as I say, she did her job extremely well the previous turn. She got the attention of the US Navy, which was precisely what her masters wanted her to do. But does she want to make herself a bit more vulnerable this turn by having armed and fueled aircraft ready on her deck, or would she rather have them, well, safety is a relative term when you're a light carrier with no armor whatsoever, but she is actually going to take a bit of a risk because she knows she's being shadowed and she knows there's no way she can get a combat air patrol up in time if the US does attack her this turn. So she's actually going to take the safe option, or safer, and leave the aircraft in her hangar for now. If she survives this turn, then maybe she'll do something different. And what about the Japanese land bases? Well, yes, like their allied opposite numbers, a lot of frantic arming and fueling is going on. So they're just going to move these guys forward. There's lots of things they want to accomplish. They want to knock out as many allied bases as they can, but others, places like Shortland particularly, are desperate to get some cover out over their naval units, and especially the convoys which are making their way to Guadalcanal, because the convoy force is particularly vulnerable. So that was the ready step. Now we get the sea movement step. And again, the US will go first. Now, I'll just draw your attention, because it's an optional rule that I'm using, to the black, or I'll show you, keep the pencil a bit more visible. Let's turn that down there a little. So the black circle or dot and the triangle indicate that ships or task forces, including ships with 3 movement factors and 2 movement factors, can be moved 2 spaces on the search board this turn. So it's basically a high-speed buff for any fast task force. Now, because of the refueling rule, WASP, her task force normally has a speed of 3, but because they're assumed to still be accompanied by fueling tankers, they're treated as having a speed of 2. But still, this is a fast one for them. Now, for the US, they actually are being a bit hesitant about moving this turn. Now, the main reason for that is they know from their reconnaissance that the Japanese have got an awful lot of surface power heading their way. And the last thing they want to do is offer themselves up on a plate, because if their task forces are caught on the surface during the day, or even worse at night, it's that stage in the war where it's not going to go very well. The Japanese actually get a +3 night fighting modifier in this scenario. So and having very fresh memories of the Battle of Savo Island, I don't think the US would really want to chance that. They'd be crazy if they did. So the idea is to keep contact with the Japanese forces, but to keep themselves at a fairly safe range. So the hitherto unsighted Task Force 11, which is Saratoga's group, is going to move. Remember, because it's someone else's search board, they're actually unaware that there's a Japanese patrol plane there. They're going to move 1 hex in that direction, but then they're going to move again. They're going to turn a little way northward. So they're keeping close, but they're dancing around a bit because they want to keep the Japanese guessing. Now, Enterprise's task force 16 definitely wants to move because the Japanese had exact information on where they were. And so they don't really want to hang around, but they're not going to move as fast as the Saratoga's task group. So all they're going to do is nudge northward 1 space. So that goes away because the Japanese have lost touch with them now. So that's fairly good positioning. They're keeping themselves within easy range of the closest elements of the Japanese task force, but they've thrown off the reconnaissance. What about WASP down here? She's thinking they have 2 choices because they ended the last turn right on the tip of San Cristobal Island, which means that if they want to carry on closing with the Japanese, they can either go south of the island and basically come up the slot. Bit dangerous because you're easier to spot when you're close to a landmass, but also if the Japanese are unsure where you are, it's a very good way of pulling a bit of a flanker on them and also directly threatening the convoy force to support Guadalcanal. But they're thinking they might go north instead, because they can still achieve all that and they can back up their fellow carriers. So Task Force 18 is going to turn northwards. But then, for their other move, they're going to go that way, park themselves very close off Guadalcanal. Now, you'll note I'm turning the task force markers as I move them, and that's another optional rule. But the reason you do that is if you do happen to merge in the same hex with an enemy task force and it results in a surface action, it basically dictates whether you end up steaming in the same direction on the battle map or whether you're on reciprocal courses. So that's why I'm doing that. So there we go. So the US task forces have moved. It's now up to the Japanese, and they are determined to go for it. Now, not being completely suicidal, the Ryujo, having done her job pretty well, is going to try and confuse the Americans by turning north, and also incidentally trying to draw them away from Guadalcanal. This patrol plane has already indicated that it's shadowing them, so it'll stay with them and maintain the contact. The Japanese main body is going to also execute a turn, but not wanting to risk their precious battleship just yet. They're actually going to turn northwards as well. The important thing is the US loses contact with them. The support force, having launched its fighters, is going to its reconnaissance planes is going to first move that way. But it's not going to go any further because it knows the Americans are out there. And it's not really going to try anything because the Chitose is quite a precious asset. Although, mind you, they do have a lot of cruisers with them, so maybe it's worth forcing something. Yeah, they're going to then turn that way and stick close to the Ryujo group. Because they've not been sighted, so they feel fairly comfortable about this. The Japanese convoy force. Now, it's a tough question what to do with this group. The decision is they are so close to their destination that despite the fact that they're being shadowed and they're potentially putting their head in the lion's mouth, they're going to go for it, because if they can get to their objective and they brazen it out and somehow survive, they will gain a ton of victory points by unloading troops on Guadalcanal. Now, we all know how that turned out historically, so it's going to be a bit of a painful one for them, but it's in the spirit of Bushido, or at least as we understand it, and it also will give the US something to do in the coming turn. And of course, that patrol plane is shadowing. Who have we still got on the Japanese side? We have the strike force, of course. Oh, yes, the most important one. So the strike force is definitely going to be moving. And they are going to start by moving straight ahead. Note that the aircraft that have taken off don't move. They remain in their original launch positions. Yeah, the strike force is just going to move forward one place, but they're going to be a bit cautious and stay behind their screen of other task forces. Because again, they've lost clear touch with the US and they don't really know what's going on. The cover force is simply going to advance 2 spaces. It's the cruiser force. They're just going to complete the protective screen around the strike force, and incidentally, the US will lose their contact with them. And I'll just leave those reconnaissance birds where they were. I think they were over here. Sorry if I've put them in the wrong place. Oh no, they were there, I think. Or were they? Oh no, actually they were there. Sorry, my bad. And lastly, the invasion force, because it's a slow force, is just going to move down to Buka. So that concludes the sea movement step. I'm going to stop here because I know this has already turned into a really long video. So we are going to call a halt there. And next time when I come back, I will dive straight into the air movement and search step. But I hope you guys have enjoyed this one, and I hope it's off to a good start. Any comments, queries, etc., most welcome. And I really look forward to seeing you all in the next video. Take care. See you guys soon. Bye.